Captain Jake Morrison had exactly 3 qualifications for his current job. He could fix anything with enough duct tape and profanity. He owned the only functional cargo hauler within 50 light-years of the outer rim, and he was too stubborn to die. Unfortunately, none of these qualifications included saving humanity from alien annihilation, which was rapidly becoming a job requirement. The Lucky Strike wasn't much to look at. Hell, it wasn't much to smell either, considering the life support had been making that wheeze for the better part of a decade. But she flew, mostly in the direction Jake pointed her, and that was more than could be said for half the ships in this sector. "Wench, you magnificent disaster," Jake muttered to himself, using the nickname he'd earned after fixing a reactor core with nothing but a wrench and what his grandmother would have called creative language. He was currently elbow-deep in the navigation console, which had started displaying star charts in what appeared to be ancient Martian hieroglyphs. Again, perhaps if you actually read the manual instead of using it as a coaster, we wouldn't have this problem, came a distinctly unimpressed voice from somewhere near his left boot. Jake didn't look down. He'd learned better. "Professor Whiskers, I've told you 1,000 times, manuals are for people who don't understand the fundamental relationship between percussive maintenance and mechanical cooperation." Professor Whiskers, all 12 pounds of orange tabby fury, emerged from under the console with a circuit board in his mouth and the kind of expression that suggested Jake was an idiot, which, to be fair, was Professor Whiskers' default expression for most of humanity. How exactly a cat had become the tactical advisor aboard a cargo hauler was a story that involved 3 bottles of Centaurian whiskey, a bet with a Martian smuggler, and Jake's unfortunate tendency to make life-altering decisions when presented with anything furry and judgmental. The fact that Professor Whiskers actually gave decent advice was either the universe's idea of a joke or proof that cats really were plotting to take over the galaxy. "The Zephyrian Empire has issued their final ultimatum," Professor Whiskers announced, dropping the circuit board and sitting with the kind of dignity that only cats could manage while surrounded by floating space debris. "Humanity has 72 hours to surrender unconditionally or face complete annihilation." Jake finally looked up from the console, a smear of grease across his forehead, and the expression of a man who had just realized his day was about to get significantly worse. "And you know this how, exactly?" "I've been monitoring their communications. Did you know they broadcast everything on the same frequency as that Terran cooking show you're always watching? The one with the man who shouts about proper seasoning techniques?" "You mean Cooking with Captain Pepper?" "That's the one. Apparently the Zephyrians find his techniques inspirational. Something about aggressive flavor enhancement, translating well to military strategy." Professor Whiskers began grooming his paw with the kind of casual indifference that suggested galactic warfare was merely Tuesday. "The point is, their entire armada is currently heading toward Earth, and we're the only human vessel in position to intercept them." Jake stared at his cat. His cat stared back with the unblinking confidence of someone who had never met a problem he couldn't solve with the proper application of attitude and strategic hair shedding. "Professor Whiskers," Jake said slowly, "we're a cargo hauler, with a navigation system that thinks we're currently orbiting ancient Mars. Life support that sounds like it's dying, and weapons systems that consist of whatever mining equipment I haven't sold yet." "Yes," Professor Whiskers agreed. "This should be entertaining." Outside the viewport, the stars continued their eternal dance, blissfully unaware that the fate of humanity now rested in the hands of a man whose greatest military achievement was winning a bar fight with a philosophy major from Europa, and a cat whose idea of tactical planning involved knocking things off tables until a solution presented itself. Jake looked at the blinking emergency beacon on his communications console, then at Professor Whiskers, then back at the beacon. Somewhere in the distance, he could swear he heard the universe laughing. The emergency beacon chose that moment to explode into life with the kind of authoritative blaring that suggested someone very important was about to make Jake's day infinitely worse. The view screen flickered, displaying what appeared to be a Christmas tree that had achieved sentience and decided to pursue a career in military leadership. "Captain Morrison," boomed the Christmas tree, which Jake's brain eventually processed as Admiral Boomsworth of Earth Command, resplendent in enough metals to armor a small moon. "Thank the stars we've reached you. Humanity's darkest hour is upon us, and you, brave soul, are our last hope against the Zephyrian menace." Jake glanced down at Professor Whiskers, who had begun that slow blink that cats used when they were witnessing peak human stupidity. "Admiral, with all due respect, I think you might have the wrong guy. I haul cargo. Sometimes I haul questionable cargo, but it's still just cargo. The closest I've come to military action is arguing with customs officials." "Nonsense." Admiral Boomsworth declared, his metals jangling with patriotic fervor. Your service record shows remarkable ingenuity under pressure, unorthodox tactical thinking, and a propensity for achieving victory against impossible odds. That was a bar fight on Titan Station, and technically, I lost that one. Details, the Admiral waved dismissively. The point is, you're there, they're coming, and frankly, our entire fleet is currently tied up dealing with a minor uprising in the vegan collective. Something about trade rights and proper vegetable classifications. The whole thing's a mess. Professor Whiskers hopped onto the communications console, his whiskers twitching with what Jake had learned to recognize as either amusement or homicidal planning. Admiral Boomsworth, if I may interrupt this inspiring display of bureaucratic incompetence, I've been analyzing the Zephyrian fleet composition. The Admiral's eyes widened to the approximate size of dinner plates. Did your cat just speak? Long story, Jake sighed. Professor Whiskers, what did you find? The Zephyrian Armada consists of 47 dreadnoughts, each roughly the size of Manhattan, commanded by one Supreme Overlord Tentacles McBadguy. Professor Whiskers paused to lick his paw, apparently considering this information as mundane as the weather. He's essentially a giant octopus with severe anger management issues and a fleet that could sterilize a planet before lunch. Tentacles McBadguy? Jake repeated slowly. I may have taken some liberties with the translation. His actual name is approximately 17 syllables and involves sounds that human vocal cords weren't designed to produce. But the tentacles part is accurate, and he does seem rather fond of bad guy behavior. Admiral Boomsworth had gone slightly pale, which was impressive considering he appeared to be broadcasting from inside a Christmas decoration. Captain Morrison, I'm transmitting all available intelligence on the Zephyrian forces. Your mission is to establish diplomatic contact and negotiate a peaceful resolution. You want me to negotiate with Tentacles McBadguy? Precisely. Using a cargo hauler held together with duct tape and prayer. Exactly. While accompanied by a cat who thinks this is all some kind of elaborate entertainment. Professor Whiskers stretched languidly. Oh, this is definitely entertainment. The question is whether it's a comedy or a tragedy, though I suppose that depends on your perspective. Jake stared at the screen, where Admiral Boomsworth was nodding with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for religious experiences or really good pizza. Admiral, you do realize that I'm completely unqualified for this, right? I mean, catastrophically unqualified. My idea of diplomacy is offering someone a beer before I tell them their engine is completely shot. Captain Morrison, the Admiral said solemnly, sometimes the galaxy doesn't give us the heroes we want. Sometimes it gives us the heroes we deserve. And right now, humanity deserves a stubborn cargo hauler and his remarkably articulate cat. I prefer the term tactical consultant, Professor Whiskers corrected primly. The transmission cut out, leaving Jake staring at a blank screen while his cat began the kind of elaborate grooming session that suggested deep philosophical contemplation was in progress. So, Jake said finally, any brilliant ideas, Professor? Professor Whiskers paused mid-lick. Well, I've been experimenting with some modifications to our cargo hold. Nothing too dramatic, just some improvements to our defensive capabilities and perhaps a few surprises that might come in handy. What kind of surprises? The kind that work better if the enemy doesn't know about them beforehand. Trust me, Jake. Have I ever led you astray? Jake considered this question for exactly 3 seconds before deciding he really didn't want to know the answer. Outside, the stars continued their ancient dance, blissfully unaware that somewhere in the vast darkness, 47 alien dreadnoughts were heading toward Earth, and humanity's fate now rested with a mechanic who talked to his cat and a cat who apparently talked back. 12 hours later, Jake found himself standing in what the Lucky Strike's computer generously called a transporter room, but which was really just a cargo bay with some blinking lights that Professor Whiskers had installed during one of his improvement phases. The cat himself sat primly in a specially modified carrier that looked suspiciously like it had been designed by someone with a PhD in engineering and access to military-grade hardware. Remind me why we're doing this again? Jake muttered, adjusting his least dirty jumpsuit, which still bore the inspiring slogan, Wrenches Repairs, we fix it till it breaks worse. Because Admiral Boomsworth asked nicely, and because I'm curious to see what passes for intelligence among creatures who think tentacles are suitable appendages for operating spacecraft, Professor Whiskers replied from inside his carrier. Also, I've taken the liberty of installing some basic translation software in your comm unit. Try not to accidentally declare war through poor grammar. The Zephyrian flagship loomed ahead of them like a metallic nightmare designed by someone with too many arms and not enough sense of architectural proportion. Jake had seen some ugly ships in his time, but this thing looked like it had been assembled by a committee of aliens who had only heard spaceships described secondhand by someone with a severe head injury. "Lucky strike, this is Zephyrian command vessel, Inevitable Doom," came a voice that sounded like someone gargling gravel mixed with existential dread. "You are cleared for docking bay 7. Do not deviate from your approach vector, do not activate any weapon systems, and do not attempt any sudden movements. Our patience with your species is already wearing thin." "Well, they seem friendly," Jake observed, piloting their shuttle toward what appeared to be the ship's mouth, because, of course, the alien dreadnought had designed their docking bay to look like a giant mouth. "Very welcoming, really rolling out the red carpet here." The docking bay was the size of a small city and filled with more armed guards than Jake had ever seen outside of a military parade. Each guard appeared to be roughly 9 feet tall, covered in what looked like armor made from nightmare fuel, and carrying weapons that probably violated several interstellar treaties. "Remember," Professor Whiskers said as they were escorted through corridors that seemed designed to make visitors feel as uncomfortable as possible, "diplomacy is about finding common ground, and if that fails, chaos tends to level the playing field remarkably effectively." The throne room, because of course there was a throne room, was the size of a football stadium and decorated in what Jake could only describe as early galactic despot style. At the center sat Supreme Overlord Tentacles McBadguy, and Jake had to admit that Professor Whiskers' translation had been remarkably accurate. The alien was essentially a massive octopus, if octopi had anger management issues and access to advanced military technology. "So," rumbled the Supreme Overlord, his voice echoing through the chamber like an earthquake with pronunciation problems. "Humanity sends a mechanic and his pet to negotiate their surrender. How appropriately pathetic." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but Professor Whiskers had somehow escaped his carrier and was now stalking directly toward the alien leader with the kind of focused intensity that usually preceded either a nap or mass destruction. "Oh no," Jake whispered. "Professor Whiskers, whatever you're thinking, don't." But it was too late. Professor Whiskers had spotted something that every cat owner in the galaxy knew spelled inevitable disaster: dangling tentacles. What happened next could only be described as diplomatic incident, in the same way that a supernova could be described as a minor lighting issue. Professor Whiskers launched himself at Supreme Overlord Tentacles McBadguy's most prominently dangling appendage with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for catnip or fresh tuna. The Supreme Overlord's roar of outrage shook the entire chamber as he tried to extract an orange tabby from his tentacle, while the cat treated the whole situation like the galaxy's most entertaining toy. Guards rushed forward, weapons raised, only to stop in confusion as their supreme leader thrashed about trying to remove what appeared to be 12 pounds of furry chaos from his person. "This is going well," Jake observed. Then louder, "Professor Whiskers, we talked about this. Diplomatic immunity doesn't cover assaulting alien dictators with cuddles." "I'm not cuddling," Professor Whiskers called back, somehow managing to sound dignified despite being attached to an alien tentacle. "I'm conducting reconnaissance." In his struggle to remove the cat, Supreme Overlord Tentacles McBadguy stumbled backward, his massive form colliding with what appeared to be the ship's primary control console. Lights began flashing, alarms started blaring, and a computerized voice began announcing something in the Zephyrian language that Jake's translator rendered as, oh dear, we're all going to die." "What did you do?" Jake shouted over the chaos. "I may have accidentally activated their self-destruct sequence," Professor Whiskers replied, finally detaching himself from the Supreme Overlord and landing gracefully on the deck. "Fascinating design flaw, really. Who puts the doomsday button right next to the throne?" The Supreme Overlord's roar of rage was now mixed with what sounded distinctly like panic as his crew scrambled to cancel the countdown that was apparently now running on every screen in the chamber. "Time to go," Professor Whiskers announced calmly, walking toward Jake as if nothing unusual had happened. "I believe we've accomplished our diplomatic objectives." "What diplomatic objectives?" Jake demanded, scooping up his cat and running toward the exit as alien guards tried to decide whether to shoot them or help their leader prevent the destruction of their own ship. "We've established that they're not as smart as they think they are," Professor Whiskers explained reasonably. "Also, I may have learned a few things about their defensive systems while I was examining that tentacle. Sometimes intelligence gathering requires getting up close and personal." Behind them, Supreme Overlord Tentacles McBadguy, was bellowing orders in a voice that suggested diplomatic relations had taken a definitive turn for the worse. "Move, move, move!" Jake shouted, sprinting through corridors that seemed to have been designed by someone who thought running should be as inconvenient as possible. Behind them, the Zephyrian flagship was experiencing what could generously be called technical difficulties, and what Jake's grandmother would have called a complete disaster of galactic proportions. Professor Whiskers, tucked securely under Jake's arm, maintained the dignified composure of someone who had definitely not just caused an interstellar incident. "Really, Jake, there's no need to panic. I managed to cancel their self-destruct sequence before we left." "You what?" Jake skidded to a halt at the airlock leading back to their shuttle. "Well, most of it. I may have left their artificial gravity generators in a state of creative flux, and possibly scrambled their communications array. Oh, and their coffee makers are now broadcasting Terran heavy metal music on all frequencies." Jake stared at his cat. Through the viewport he could see the Zephyrin flagship listing to one side, while various sections flickered between normal gravity and what appeared to be carnival ride physics. Small explosions dotted the hull like deadly fireworks, and if Jake wasn't mistaken, he could hear the distant sounds of thrash metal echoing through the corridors. "Professor Whiskers, please tell me you didn't turn their entire flagship into a floating disaster." "Of course not," Professor Whiskers replied with wounded dignity. "I turned it into a floating disaster with an excellent sound system." The shuttle bay doors began closing with the kind of mechanical determination that suggested someone had finally regained enough control to try trapping them. Jake lunged for their shuttle controls as the Lucky Strike's automated systems kicked in, dragging their small craft out of the docking bay with approximately 3 inches to spare. "This is Supreme Overlord Tentacle's MacBag Guy to all Zephyrian vessels," came a transmission that sounded like someone trying to maintain military composure while their flagship played death metal at maximum volume. "The human vessel and its demonic feline companion are to be destroyed immediately. I want them vaporized, disintegrated, and then vaporized again for good measure." "Well," Jake observed, piloting their shuttle back toward the Lucky Strike as the Zephyrian fleet began turning toward them with the coordinated precision of a very large, very angry swarm. "I think we can safely say negotiations have concluded." "Actually, I'd call them a complete success," Professor Whiskers said, settling into his favorite spot on the console. "We've learned valuable intelligence about their fleet composition, tactical responses, and command structure. Plus, we've established ourselves as a credible threat." "Credible threat?" "Professor Whiskers, we're flying a cargo hauler that's held together with industrial adhesive and wishful thinking. They have 47 dreadnoughts, each of which could probably use our ship as a paperweight." "Yes, but they don't know about the modifications I've made to our cargo hold." Jake felt that familiar sinking sensation that usually preceded Professor Whiskers revealing one of his improvements. "What modifications?" "Oh, nothing too dramatic. I've simply repurposed our mining equipment into a more tactical configuration. Plus, I may have borrowed a few design concepts from some old Terran military manuals I've found in your collection." "What military manuals? I don't have any military manuals." "The ones hidden behind your stash of vintage engine repair guides. Really, Jake, did you think I wouldn't notice? I'm a cat. We notice everything, especially things people try to hide." As they docked with the Lucky Strike, Jake's mind raced through his collection of technical manuals, trying to remember what military publications he might have accidentally acquired over the years. Then it hit him like a meteor of pure dread. "Professor Whiskers, please tell me you didn't base your modifications on guerrilla warfare in the modern age by Colonel Mad Dog McCready. Among others, though I particularly enjoyed Advanced Psychological Warfare Techniques by Dr. Luna Martinez. Fascinating insights into the application of chaos theory to military strategy." The Lucky Strike's engines roared to life with a sound that was definitely not standard for civilian cargo haulers. Through the view screen, Jake watched the Zephyrin fleet forming attack formations, with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested they'd done this many times before, and were very good at it. "Incoming transmission," the ship's computer announced in its perpetually bored tone. "This is Admiral Krexnot of the Zephyrian 3rd Battle Group," came a voice that sounded like someone had taught a glacier how to be indignant. "Human vessel, you are completely surrounded and outnumbered. Surrender immediately and we promise your deaths will be relatively quick." Jake looked at Professor Whiskers, who had begun the slow tail twitch that indicated either deep concentration or imminent chaos. "Any brilliant strategies, tactical consultant?" "Several, but first I need you to jettison cargo container 7. "The one with the mining charges?" "Not anymore. I've made some improvements. Trust me, Jake. When have my modifications ever let us down? Jake decided not to answer that question and reached for the cargo release controls. Outside, 47 alien dreadnoughts were moving into position with the coordinated grace of predators who had spotted easy prey. Each ship bristled with enough firepower to sterilize a small moon, their hulls gleaming with the kind of technological superiority that suggested humanity's brief stint as a spacefaring species was about to come to an embarrassing end. "Container 7 away," Jake announced, watching a standard shipping container drift away from their ship with deceptive innocence. "Excellent. Now, on my mark, activate the tractor beam and swing us around that container in a tight spiral, maximum velocity." "Professor Whiskers, that's insane. We'll tear the ship apart." "Jake, do you trust me?" Jake looked at his cat, who was sitting with the calm confidence of someone who had never met a problem he couldn't solve with the proper application of feline logic and controlled explosions. "I trust you," Jake said, and realized with some surprise that he meant it. The Zephyrian fleet opened fire just as the Lucky Strike whipped around the cargo container, in a maneuver that would have been impossible for any ship not held together by duct tape and maintained by someone who understood that sometimes the laws of physics were merely suggestions. That's when Professor Whisker's cargo container revealed its true nature. Instead of standard mining equipment, it had been converted into what could only be described as a surprise delivery system, containing approximately 50 smaller containers, each one equipped with its own propulsion system and painted in colors that hurt to look at directly. "What are those?" Jake shouted over the sound of their engines screaming in protest. "Psychological warfare," Professor Whiskers replied calmly. "Each container contains a different surprise. Some have holographic projectors displaying images of Earth cats in attack poses. Others are broadcasting that Terran death metal at frequencies specifically designed to interfere with Zephyrian neural pathways. And a few contain actual mining charges, just to keep things interesting." The effect on the Zephyrian fleet was immediate and spectacular. Their precise formations dissolved into chaos as ships tried to avoid what appeared to be an attack by flying rainbow containers, while their communication systems were flooded with images of cats and the dulcet sounds of Screaming Death Weasel by the Martian Mayhem Machine. "This is Admiral Krexnot to all ships," came an increasingly frantic transmission. "What are those things? Why are there cats on my view screen? And what is that horrible noise?" "Phase 2, Professor Whiskers announced, and Jake realized their cargo hold was opening again. What emerged from the Lucky Strike's cargo hold defied every law of physics, military strategy, and common sense that Jake had ever learned. It also defied several laws he was pretty sure Professor Whiskers had invented specifically for this occasion. Are those robotic mice?" Jake stared in horror and fascination as dozens of metallic objects streamed from their ship, each one roughly the size of a dinner plate, and moving with the erratic, unpredictable motion of something that had been designed by someone who understood that the best way to confuse an enemy was to confuse yourself first. "Remote-controlled mining drones," Professor Whiskers corrected primly. "I've simply modified their targeting systems and given them a more intuitive movement pattern, based on extensive research into optimal prey behavior." The robotic mice swarmed through the Zephyrian fleet with a chaos that was beautiful to watch and terrifying to contemplate. Each drone weaved between the massive dreadnoughts with movements that followed no tactical manual ever written, because they were following something far more ancient and effective, the movement patterns of things cats like to chase. "This is Admiral Krexnoth," came the increasingly desperate transmission. "All ships target the small objects, use point defense systems, use everything. Why won't they fly in straight lines? What kind of military training produces movement patterns like this?" "The kind that involves millions of years of evolution and a deep understanding of predator-prey dynamics," Professor Whiskers observed, watching his drones dart between energy beams with the kind of satisfaction that comes from a plan working exactly as intended. "Also, I may have programmed them with some behavioral patterns I learned from watching you try to catch that laser pointer dot last year. It was one time, and I was checking the calibration on my precision welding tool," Jake protested, then paused as the implications hit him. "Wait, you base their movement patterns on watching me fail to catch a dot of light?" "Among other sources. I also studied several hours of footage of Earth's squirrels evading traffic, 3 documentaries about evasive maneuvers in nature, and that embarrassing incident where you tried to catch me after I knocked your coffee mug off the table." The robotic mice had reached their targets now, and the Zephyrian fleet discovered that their point defense systems, designed to intercept missiles and torpedoes that moved in predictable trajectories, were completely useless against objects that moved like caffeinated rodents with attention deficit disorder. Small explosions began blooming across the hulls of the alien dreadnoughts, as the mining drones delivered their payloads with precision strikes to what Professor Whiskers had apparently identified as critical systems. But these weren't the massive explosions that would destroy a ship outright. Instead, they were surgical strikes designed to cause maximum inconvenience and confusion. Weapons systems offline on Deck 7, came panicked reports over the Zephyrian communication channels. Life support is playing children's lullabies in Section 12. The food replicators are only producing Earth breakfast cereals. What is happening to us? Psychological warfare, Professor Whiskers explained, beginning to groom his paw with the casual air of someone discussing the weather. I've studied human military history extensively, Jake. Do you know what the most effective weapon in any conflict is? Bigger guns? Jake guessed, wrestling with the controls as he piloted their ship through a debris field that was rapidly becoming a light show of confused alien weaponry and erratically moving robotic mice. Confusion. An enemy who doesn't understand what's happening to them cannot mount an effective defense. Right now, the Zephyrian fleet is trying to respond to a threat that doesn't follow any tactical doctrine they've ever encountered. Their computers are trying to calculate intercept courses for objects that move like living creatures. Their weapons systems are optimized for large targets moving in predictable patterns, and their command structure is designed around the assumption that their enemies will behave rationally. As if to prove his point, one of the Zephyrian dreadnoughts fired a massive energy beam at a cluster of robotic mice, only to watch them scatter at the last second. The beam instead struck another Zephyrian ship, whose shields flared and failed under friendly fire. "This is Supreme Overlord Tentacles McBadguy," came a transmission that sounded like someone trying to maintain dignity while their empire crumbled around them. "All ships, cease fire immediately. You're shooting each other. How are you shooting each other? These are supposed to be precision targeting systems." "Yes, well, precision targeting assumes your targets behave precisely," Professor Whiskers observed. "Phase 3 should be particularly entertaining." "There's a Phase 3?" Jake asked, though he was beginning to suspect he really didn't want to know. "Oh yes. You see, while the drones are providing distraction and tactical disruption, I've been using our mining lasers to make some modifications to the local asteroid field." Jake looked at the tactical display and felt his blood pressure spike to levels that probably violated several health and safety regulations. The asteroid field they'd been fighting near was moving, not drifting in normal orbital patterns but moving with purpose and direction, directly toward the Zephyrian fleet. "Professor Whiskers, please tell me you didn't turn an entire asteroid field into a weapon." "I prefer to think of it as creative environmental modification. You see, those asteroids were just sitting there, serving no useful purpose, so I gave them one. Each asteroid now has a small mining charge attached to its core, programmed to detonate at precisely the right moment to alter their trajectory. It's really quite elegant." The Zephyrian fleet, already dealing with swarming robotic mice and friendly fire incidents, now found themselves facing a slowly accelerating wall of space rocks, each one the size of a city block and moving with the inexorable patience of geological timescales compressed into minutes. "This is impossible," Admiral Kraxnoth transmitted, and Jake could hear the edge of panic in his voice. "Asteroids don't just decide to attack a fleet. The physics alone are surprisingly flexible when you understand the right pressure points," Professor Whiskers finished. "Jake, I need you to take us through the center of their formation. Maximum speed." "Through the center? Professor Whiskers, that's suicide. Even with their systems disrupted, there are still 47 ships, with enough firepower to turn us into component atoms." "Yes, but they won't fire on us." "Well, why not?" Professor Whiskers' twitched with what Jake had learned to recognize as supreme confidence mixed with barely contained amusement. "Because we're going to be directly between them and the asteroids. If they shoot at us and miss, they hit the asteroids and trigger premature detonations. If they hit the asteroids intentionally to stop them, they trigger the mining charges I've attached, which will fragment each asteroid into approximately 50 smaller projectiles moving at high velocity. And if they do nothing, the asteroids hit them anyway," Jake finished, beginning to understand the diabolical elegance of his cat's plan. "Exactly. It's what human military theorists call a no-win scenario, though I prefer to think of it as aggressive problem-solving with geological assistance." The Lucky Strike dove toward the heart of the Zephyrian formation, pursued by increasingly frantic alien communications as their fleet tried to respond to a tactical situation that violated everything they understood about space combat. Behind them, the asteroid field continued its patient, inexorable advance, while robotic mice darted through their formations like metallic chaos incarnate. "Al ships, new plan," Supreme Overlord Tentacles McBadguy transmitted, his voice now carrying the desperate edge of someone whose carefully ordered universe had been replaced by weaponized insanity. "Focus all fire on the human vessel. Ignore everything else. If we can destroy that ship, perhaps this nightmare will end." Oh, I don't think so," Professor Whiskers said calmly, and pressed a button that Jake was absolutely certain hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. Every single robotic mouse in the Zephyrian fleet suddenly changed direction, converging on their own ship with movements so erratic and unpredictable that the alien targeting computers gave up trying to calculate intercept courses and simply displayed error messages in 17 different languages. "What are you doing?" Jake shouted, watching dozens of his cat's mechanical creations swarming toward them like a metallic hurricane. "Providing cover," Professor Whiskers replied, and demonstrating the final principle of effective psychological warfare. Sometimes the most effective defense is to make yourself appear completely insane. The robotic mice reached the Lucky Strike and began attaching themselves to the hull in patterns that formed what appeared to be armor plating, if armor plating had been designed by someone who thought protection should also involve interpretive dance. The Zephyrian weapons fire, already confused by the erratic movement patterns, now had to contend with a target that looked like it had been attacked by a swarm of mechanical insects and somehow convinced them to become decorative. "This is it," Jake muttered, watching the tactical display as 47 alien dreadnoughts finally achieved target lock on their position. "It's been an honor serving with you, Professor Whiskers." "Oh, we're not done yet," his cat replied cheerfully. "Impact in 3, 2, 1. The asteroid field arrived. What followed could only be described as the most spectacular demonstration of applied chaos theory in galactic history. The asteroid field, moving with the patient inevitability of Professor Whiskers' planning, collided with the Zephyrian fleet in a symphony of destruction that would be studied in military academies for the next 1,000 years, assuming anyone could figure out how to replicate it. The first asteroid struck the dreadnought Inevitable Conquest with a sound that Jake felt in his bones even through the vacuum of space. The mining charge Professor Whiskers had attached detonated exactly as calculated, fragmenting the space rock into a shotgun blast of smaller projectiles that peppered the alien ship's hull like cosmic buckshot. "Shields failing on multiple vessels," came panicked transmissions from across the Zephyrian fleet. "Hull breaches on decks 7 through 12. Why are the rocks exploding? Since when do rocks explode?" "Since I gave them a reason to," Professor Whiskers observed, watching the tactical display with the satisfaction of someone whose elaborate plan was unfolding with clockwork precision. "Jake, take us out of the formation. Our work here is done." The Lucky Strike, still decorated with its armor of robotic mice, slipped through the chaos like a whisper of sanity in a universe gone mad. Around them, the remaining asteroids continued their methodical bombardment of alien ships that had been designed to fight wars, not geological events with attitude problems. Supreme Overlord Tentacles McBadguy's flagship, still listing from its earlier encounter with Professor Whiskers' diplomatic approach, was struck by 3 asteroids simultaneously. The mining charges detonated in sequence, creating a light show that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been so thoroughly devastating to alien morale. "Ships," came the Supreme Overlord's final transmission, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose entire worldview had been systematically demolished by a cargo hauler and its feline tactical consultant. "Retreat to minimum safe distance. Signal the fleet. Tell them we cannot defeat this enemy." "What enemy?" Admiral Krexnoth responded desperately. "What do we call them in our reports? How do we explain this to High Command?" There was a long pause, filled only by the sounds of continuing explosions as the asteroid field completed its work of turning the Zephyrian armada from a conquering force into a collection of very expensive space debris. "We call them," Supreme Overlord Tentacles McBadguy said finally, "the species that weaponized their pets." Jake looked at Professor Whiskers, who had curled up in his favorite spot on the console and was grooming his paw with the kind of casual indifference that suggested turning an entire alien armada into scrap metal was just another Tuesday. "Professor Whiskers," Jake said slowly, "how long have you been planning this?" "Oh, since about the second day you brought me aboard," his cat replied without looking up from his grooming. I noticed you had a tendency to get into trouble, and I thought it might be useful to prepare some contingencies. The asteroid field modification was particularly challenging. Do you know how difficult it is to calculate orbital mechanics when you don't have opposable thumbs? You've been preparing for interstellar warfare since I adopted you? Adopted? Jake, I chose you. There's a difference. I needed a human with the right combination of mechanical aptitude, stubborn refusal to accept impossible situations, and complete inability to recognize when he's in over his head. You were perfect. Through the viewscreen, Jake watched the remnants of the Zephyrin fleet limping away at maximum speed, their formation reduced to whatever ships could still maintain structural integrity after their encounter with weaponized geology. The robotic mice were detaching themselves from the Lucky Strike's hull and scattering into space, their mission complete. Incoming transmission from Earth Command, the ship's computer announced. Admiral Boomsworth's face appeared on the screen, his expression cycling through disbelief, amazement, and what appeared to be the early stages of a nervous breakdown. Captain Morrison, our long-range sensors are detecting, well, they're detecting what appears to be the complete destruction of the Zephyrian Armada. Please, tell me you didn't actually defeat a fleet of 47 dreadnoughts using mining equipment and psychological warfare? Jake finished. Well, technically, Professor Whiskers defeated them. I just drove. The cat, Admiral Boomsworth said slowly. The cat defeated the Zephyrian Armada. Among other things, Professor Whiskers said, hopping onto the console where the Admiral could see him. I also established several important diplomatic precedents, demonstrated the effectiveness of asymmetric warfare tactics, and solved the immediate threat to human space. You're welcome. Admiral Boomsworth stared at Professor Whiskers for a long moment, then reached for something off-screen that looked suspiciously like a bottle of whiskey. Captain Morrison, I'm promoting you to Admiral. Admiral Morrison. Congratulations. I don't want to be an admiral, Jake protested. I want to go back to hauling cargo and fixing engines and having a nice, quiet life that doesn't involve explaining to alien empires why they shouldn't threaten humanity. Too late, Admiral Boomsworth said, taking what was definitely a drink from what was definitely a bottle. As of today, you and Professor Whiskers are officially the first line of defense for human space. The Zephyrian Empire has already transmitted a formal apology to Earth, along with a treaty that grants humanity complete autonomy in this sector and a promise never to approach any system containing Earthcats. What about the other alien empires? Professor Whiskers asked with the tone of someone who was already considering his next project. Word travels fast in this part of the galaxy, the Admiral replied. The Regalian Confederacy has requested a non-aggression pact. The Andromedan Trade Union wants to establish diplomatic relations, and the Galactic Council has officially classified Earth as a Do Not Disturb zone, with a special notation about the tactical capabilities of indigenous feline species. Jake looked at his cat, who was now sitting with the kind of smug satisfaction that only cats could achieve after successfully conquering an alien armada before lunch. Professor Whiskers, Jake said carefully, please tell me you're not planning to do this again. Oh, this was just a warm-up exercise, Professor Whiskers replied cheerfully. I've been studying the defensive capabilities of 17 other alien species, and I have some fascinating ideas about improving our cargo hold configurations. Did you know that the Centaurian Empire is afraid of small, furry creatures that move unpredictably? Something about their evolutionary history involving predators that... Jake reached over and very gently closed the communications channel. Outside the viewport, space looked exactly the same as it always had. Vast, dark, and filled with infinite possibilities. But somewhere in that darkness, the word was spreading through the galaxy's communication networks, carried by traders and diplomats and the occasional fleeing armada. Humanity had arrived on the galactic stage, and they had brought their cats. The aliens were still whispering about what happened, and would continue to whisper for generations to come. They spoke of a species that had somehow convinced their predators to become partners, of warriors who fought with chaos instead of order, and of a small orange cat who had looked at the most powerful military force in 3 sectors and decided it needed to be taught some manners. But Jake Morrison, former cargo hauler and current admiral despite his protests, was already thinking about his next shipment of industrial lubricants to the Titan colonies. After all, someone had to keep the galaxy's machinery running, even if that machinery was now protected by the most feared tactical consultant in known space, who happened to be a 12-pound tabby with a talent for turning ordinary objects into instruments of psychological warfare. Professor Whiskers curled up for a nap, dreaming of asteroid fields and alien tentacles, while the Lucky Strike continued on its course through stars that suddenly seemed much more peaceful than they had that morning. The galaxy had learned an important lesson. Never underestimate the tactical capabilities of a species that had spent thousands of years sharing their homes with creatures that hunted for fun.